Good day, and welcome to another episode of I Was Just Thinking. If you're new to this webcast, my name is Rudy Maxa. I'm a travel journalist and travel broadcaster. And when COVID started, I co-host a syndicated commercial radio show and have for, 8 or 9 years, and interview a lot of people, but they're like these 6-minute segments. They're very short. And when COVID came along, I thought, I want to interview somebody who's really interesting at longer lengths. And so this webcast was born. In the center of your screen, you will see today's guest. His name is Geoffrey Weill. He is a legendary public relations executive and owner of his own company called Weill PR, based in Manhattan, in New York. I have known him for many years. We're not the closest of friends. I don't know. Have we had him? Many years, right. I've worked with him as a travel journalist, and that's part of the burden that PR people in the travel PR business have to bear, is guys like me or women who are probably nicer than I am. But he's known for representing, among other places, the country of Israel, Germany at one point. I don't know if you still represent them. Do you?
No.
Okay, but a whole long and many, many luxury hotels and resorts all around the world. I periodically get press releases about a new client, and I go, geez, why didn't I go into public relations instead of travel journalism? At any rate, I've asked, normally I start with a little bit of a little thing about wine and what you can do in that region in visiting vineyards or wineries. But then we bring the guest in, but Geoffrey's traveled all over the world. And what I'm going to be sipping here is from the region of Normandy, which is in northern France. You may know some of the things that are there. Mont Saint-Michel, that town that's surrounded by, when the tide is out, sort of sand, and then the tide comes in, and the castle-like walls surround Mont Saint-Michel, and it seems to be floating in the middle of the water. You can only access it during low tide, obviously, by road. The invasion of D-Day, Normandy Beach, took place on Normandy. And there's a resort town called Deauville, Deauville. You will find me mangling French all throughout this show, which is why I've asked Andrew to stay with me, because he doesn't mangle French. I can do German. He speaks German fluently. But so what I wanted to open was something from the region of Normandy, and it's most famous for two kinds of brandy. An apple called Calvados. There's actually a region there called Calvados. And there are a lot of apple trees, about 200 different varieties, and also pear trees. And they make this liqueur out of apple and pears. So it's a very, very sweet. This is from a producer called, Père, which is father, I guess. Maglioire. Magloire. Like the Loire region, I guess, huh?
And no, My Glory.
It's what?
My Glory.
My Glory. Yeah. Didn't you have a relative who always pronounced everything? And there are any number of places that make alcoholic apple cider, for lack of a better phrase, in the world, including the United States. But Calvados is considered sort of the prince among them, among the regions. And this is from a region. There are 3 regions that produce Calvados. This is from a region. I had to call my daughter in France to pronounce it. Where did I write it down? Oh, I put it on my computer. I can't read it. I think it's called Pays d'Auge, D''Auge. Am I close?
Yeah.
Pays, A-Y-S, like pay, but of course they pronounce it payee instead of pays. This is considered the most prestigious of the 3 regions where the Calvados is produced. To be called Calvados, it has to be aged in wood barrels for at least 2 years. If it's XO, you can see XO here, that's at least 10 years it must be aged. And it is you can use it as an aperitif before dinner, as an aperitif, or you can use it, or you can drink it, or you can drink it after dinner. Now, this bottle is I've probably had it for 20 years. So it's already open, and it's still about 3/4 full. And the nice thing about Calvados is you can keep it forever, for an indefinite amount of time. It's not going to go bad as long as you keep the cork in it, which I'll put back in right now. Smells like apple, and I'm told, I've never done a serious tasting of it, I'm told that the more age you have in a Calvados, the more it starts tasting a little less appley and more like what we would call a cognac, what we know is a cognac. But let me just taste this, see how many apples are left in this one here. There's still some apples in this. You can see it's a very golden hue, like you would expect of a cognac. Really a lovely thing to end dinner with. And Americans don't drink enough cognac or enough Calvados for that matter. We don't, except you're going to a very fancy black tie something. They might give you an after dinner drink, as they would call it, or an aperitif. But it's usually start with champagne and end with champagne. But ending with something like Calvados, which some people consider a digestive, it'll help you digest your meal, is a grand thing. Are you a Calvados guy, Geoffrey?
Yes. In fact, I'm also a pear guy. Pear Williams, I'm very partial to. In fact, I have a bottle with the pear in it.
And putting this, and when I was trying to figure out what kind of wine, because I've done, Burgundy, all the general, New Zealand, everything. But I found this bottle in my cellar, the cellar being my apartment, Geoffrey. And I thought, wow, I haven't had a Calvados in years. And I'm so glad I found this, because we ought to do more of this. All right, let's get to the main act, which is Geoffrey Weill, who has a new book out called All Abroad. And if you look at it very quickly, All Aboard. No, All Abroad. If you look at it quickly, it looks like All Abroad, but the title is All Aboard. We'll flash a picture of the cover in a moment. I know Joe will do that. And I must tell you, I got an email from Geoffrey's PR people or publisher, the University of Wisconsin, saying, "Oh, Geoffrey Weill's got a new book out called," I thought it was All Aboard. It is, and it's All Abroad. And I thought it was going to be his history of being a travel PR executive and having to deal with miscreants like me and all kinds of lesser forms of life. Here's a picture of the cover. You can see the subtitle is A Memoir of Travel Obsession. And the word here is obsession. Now, I know what you're thinking. Oh, yeah, we all love to travel. I have that same obsession. You don't have an obsession like Geoffrey has an obsession. He's got a very specific kind of, let me just read something from I believe this is from the introduction. This is Geoffrey writing. This is the story of an English boy, then man, in desperate need of escape from a childhood and adolescence that were outwardly charmed, all calm, and happiness. Yet inwardly, all of these were laced with claustrophobic insecurity, regimentation, blame, and torment. Others might have turned to crime, to booze, to drugs. But because my need to escape started early, long before any of those avenues would have been remotely achievable, I sought solace elsewhere, ultimately in travel. Okay, we're still on the travel thing. But as much as Geoffrey, and I'll let him tell you all this, I'll let you be a guest in just a moment, Geoffrey. I just want to set up the platform here.
I'm enjoying this.
Much as Geoffrey does like to travel and see beautiful sights, and so his passion is very specialized. His was an obsession, and let me quote him again, with the conveyances, the planes, the airports, the ships, the trains, and the hotels that await journey's end, particularly hotels. He, as a young boy, while the rest of us were playing with Legos, was avidly collecting, when he was growing up in London, train schedules, airplane schedules, learning about airplanes, finding out how you book hotels, reading old National Geographics and seeing advertisements for hotels. Yes, the pictures were really pretty of French Polynesia, but he wanted to know about the resort there. Now, let's start with that, Geoffrey. You're a young boy in London. Tell me about your parents and what kind of the environment you grew up in.
I grew up with 40-year-old parents who I have an older brother, 15 years older than I. And my father was born in London. His father came from Germany at the turn of the 20th century. My mother was born in Australia and came to England in 1918. And I would hear journeys about their travels, and it would infuse me. My mother's journey to England in 1918 took them through the Panama Canal that had just been opened. There still were the raw tree trunks showing in the water. And 300 miles from England, their ship was torpedoed by a German submarine. It didn't sink. They survived it, and they got to England. And I just grew up on these stories of epic voyages. My my father's bar mitzvah was in Germany in 1922, and my father would talk about the private railroad car that took all the guests from the North Sea to Frankfurt, and I just became. This was like listening to fairy tales that weren't fairy tales; they were true. And I suppose if you want to psychoanalyze it, it was a way to get close to my father, to hear about all of these stories, and my mother, but my father particularly. And he had this map drawer that was sort of like a shrine. And every Sunday morning, he and I would go through it and look at maps and look at hotel guides. He was not in the least interested in churches or museums or art galleries. He was interested in where you ate and how you got there, and sitting in cafes, and just that was the part of travel that seemed to me the exciting part.
I had a mother who insisted that you should never, she didn't want you to look, seem, sound, dress, appear, or behave in any way she considered Jewish. Even more than that, she didn't want you to even have a lower class English accent. So you said you spent 12 years of your life engaged in what you called unceasing torture of vocal drills and the repetition of vowel sounds to ensure you would never ever have a Cockney-tinged vowel. You had to speak beautifully. And did she imagine for you that you were going to perhaps grow up as a minor royal?
No, but she was of a certain era when people who spoke in certain ways were judged by how they spoke. It doesn't exist in England anymore, but when I was a little boy in the 50s, it did exist. And even when I left England in 1970, you could not get a job on the BBC if you spoke incorrectly. And my mother was obsessed with these two things, that I should speak perfectly and not look, seem, behave in any way she considered Jewish. And I think I mentioned in the book that it was sort of like Henry Higgins meets Fagin, and I was not allowed to speak in a way she disapproved of. The fact that I dropped R's and did have a lisp didn't matter. It was the pattern of breeding that mattered.
And how did you early on, you started thinking about escaping when you were in your high school years, I would say, if not earlier. How did you come to regard England as a drab, sort of gray place that was not too exciting to you? Now, I know certainly London was heavily bombed by the Germans during the World War. And when you were growing up, I mean, you were born the same year I was, 1949. When you grew up, there was still, and I remember going to London as a kid because I was living in Germany at the time. And it was very difficult to get fresh fruit, fresh vegetables. There were buildings that had been bombed out that were still standing. Is that what created this sense of I want to be somewhere else, or was it those National Geographic magazines that you would flip through?
It was a combination. It was a combination. London was drab. London was grey. And I grew up in a London that was, yes, it was the 1950s, but not like it wasn't the Eisenhower America of the 50s. It really was a London of the 1920s and 1930s. Milk was delivered. We had a we were middle class. We weren't poor and we weren't wealthy, but we had a refrigerator that was from, I don't know, 1940. We had a stove that was probably from 1912. It was grey. London was full of bomb sites, but that really wasn't it. It was, I seemed to suffer. I went to a public school, i.e. a private school, and the only public school in England that had no quota for Jews. Every other one probably still does or did, even if it's not mentioned. But in those days, it was mentioned. But the City of London school had no quota, and a quarter of the pupils were Jewish. And yet there was a lot of anti-Semitism. And for a reason that wasn't, well, it is clear to me why. I was brought up as an English boy who occasionally went to synagogue, but I was English. And when the anti-Semitism hit me, I was outraged. The other Jewish kids didn't seem to care. It didn't seem to matter. It mattered to me. And so I sort of began to feel that England wasn't, even though I still to this day adore London and adore England, and I'm a subscriber to Majesty magazine.
I should interrupt you. I should send this Geoffrey at the start. I should tell you, as I mentioned, his firm is in New York, and Geoffrey has lived in New York for decades. So we are reaching him at his home in New York today. Okay, so you're not in London today.
Yeah. I moved to New York in 1973, and that's actually where the book begins. But my brother left home when I was 8, and I sort of inherited his bedroom, including his collection of National Geographic magazines. And there was a lot of trauma involved in his departure and how the house was reorganized around. The rooms were kind of re-altered. I inherited his room and his National Geographic magazines, and I would sit on the floor, and I really wasn't interested in the articles. I was interested in these ads at the front and the back of America, or how America viewed the world.
What think about those ads? What so captivated you at that point in your life?
It was, I suppose, the lavishness, the wealth, the kitchens enthralled me. These great kitchens with formica counters, and I mean, we lived in a flat that was built in 1900, and the kitchen had not changed since 1900. And there were ads for Pan American and for the Queen Mary, and there were ads for England that didn't look to me like England. There was a kind of rose-colored glow over them, which made me realize that you could be truthful in describing a place, but color it a little bit to make it more appealing. And I would sit on the floor, and I mean, that was my escape.
Right, and you would go, while some kids would go out to sneak a cigarette, you would try to go down to near Piccadilly's Circle on Regent, the big shopping street, Regent Street, because that's where the airline offices were, and you could go in there and get their schedules, and maybe even if you're really lucky, a poster. Am I correct?
Exactly, and the way I wrote it in the book, I said that if I could get out of playing rugby, I would take the tube to Piccadilly Circus and walk up Shaftesbury Avenue. And those of you people who know London, and I said, I went in search of my passions. And anybody who knows London would know that where I was going, where all the strip clubs were and are, and where all the sleazy parts of London are. But what I was really going to do was to find travel posters and theatre posters and timetables, and I would collect them all and then take the tube home.
And you would read them. You didn't just collect them, you memorized them.
I studied them. I learned them. It wasn't something just to have a quick look at. This was learning, deep studying. I would know how to get from Brazzaville to Delhi and where to change planes and how to do it at the age of 12. And it was weird. I was quite odd.
Yes.
Maybe I still am, but I was lucky enough to be able to turn my peculiar.
Excuse me, is that Alan in the middle in that picture?
That's Alan Cumming. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, the actor. All right, I'm sorry. Yes,
yes.
you were weird, but you tell us about the creating your own airline.
Yeah, I would decide that I was going to design an airline based in Istanbul, and
Okay.
I would map out all the routes that it would take. This is when I was 12 and 13 and 14, and I had been given by my parents a typewriter for my bar mitzvah, and I designed an airline and with all of the flights and what meals would be served and what plane it would be used with, and this was hours of work, and I draw maps, and then at the back there would be a list of the airline's offices, all in made up addresses, but in actually the right places where airline offices would have been in those days. Nowadays airlines don't have offices, but in the 50s and 60s they did.
Mm-hmm.
And I would produce them into a timetable that's folded, and it was, I think I know that I have one somewhere, and I've been looking for it for a couple of years, but we have a basement full of crap of crap that I have collected over the years, and it's hard to find. Otherwise I would show you.
Point when you were young and people were saying, what do you want to be when you grow up? And people were saying things like soldiers and doctors and nurses. You said you wanted to be a what did you want it to be? You wanted to serve. You wanted to have a career in airline catering.
Yeah, it was extremely weird, and I even knew it at the time. Our math teacher, the reason I don't remember, I was about 14, asked us what we wanted to be. And I came up with this peculiar career goal that even then I knew was weird, that I would be in airline catering and decide which meals and what foods would be served on the flight from Nairobi to Delhi or Paris to
really weird.
Madrid. And it was weird. Yeah, I knew it was weird then.
My guest is Geoffrey Weill. He has a new book out called All Abroad. It actually comes out February 22nd, though you can find it now. You can pre-order it now on Amazon and the places you might normally get books. We'll talk about that in a moment. You had, of all these, I mean, you memorized airline routes. You memorized what planes were flying those routes. But you had a particular passion for hotels. And I am struck, by the way, this book is an incredible read. Normally when I have a guest, I will skim a book because I have to read some books for the radio show. I have to read books for my newsletter. And so, I'll read a few chapters, skim it, get a feel for it. This, I had to read every word. This book will make you laugh and it'll make you cry. There are enormous surprises in here. I can't recommend it enough. But hotels, let me quote. You call it, you said if Freud had identified, well, anyway, I'll leave it aside Freud. Freud would have a particular name for your particular passion because you write, I cannot, this is when you were young and going to hotels. I cannot help but note the tiniest details, from the cut of the concierge's jacket to the timbre or the kind of typeface on the room service menu, to the display of amenities in the lobby, in the bathroom counter, to the arching of the vaulted marble colonnade. You remember the Metropole in Brighton, where my family lives now, or the Grand next door, where you weren't allowed to stay. It was a little too fancy. But you remember such details of these hotels. Were you taking notes?
No, I was. It's very weird. I can remember these visits to Brighton when I was 4 and 5 and 6 and 7. With enormous clarity. And in the book, I also talk about my first continental trip when I was 6. And I remember I noted down in my mind details of the most bizarre number of details. And it was, I have 3 kids and I've traveled with them all over the world. Mm-hmm. And obviously when they were 6, or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10, they would sleep either with my wife and me or in a room connected. I didn't. I was 6, and I was in a grand hotel like the Metropole in Brighton, but I had my own room, which could be on a different floor to my parents. Um, it didn't have a bathroom. Theirs did. There was a chamber pot in the bedside table. There was a sink and towels. And I was completely isolated from them, and they didn't seem to worry about it. And as it happened, there was nothing to worry about. But it was a very different world. Uh, and I would come back to my room after dinner, and the bed would be turned down, and there would be a hot water bottle probably in the bed, and it was fabulous. It was sheer joy. I also write about the fact that as I didn't have a private bathroom, you had to travel with robe and slippers, and you would go down the hall to the quote public bathroom, which was a private room that had a bathtub, where you locked the door and you took a bath. But the bath was still warm from the last occupant.
Same water?
No,
Oh,
not the same water. That
okay.
you had to pay extra for that. No,
Okay.
it was not the same water, but it was still warm. And in England they didn't have showers until about 1990, and so the room was still warm from the previous occupant with his or her dermatitis or whatever they might have been traveling with. And it never occurred to me that it was a little bit unhygienic or just a little bit strange. And also in the book, I mention another facet of the 50s in England. When I took a library book back to the public library, it wasn't just put back on the shelves. Every book was fumigated, because in the 50s, people sat in bed and they coughed and they spat and they had TB. And when you took a book back, it was cleansed. And here we are in the middle of COVID. And I still, to this day, cannot take out a book from the library and read it. I have a serious aversion to it. A library book is a kind of host for germs. And I'm not a clean freak. I mean, I do bathe, but I'm not a nut job about it. But it really was very interesting. And it interested me now that, here during COVID, I cannot go to our local library anymore, but I can order a book from them and take it home. And I wonder how clean it is. I wonder how many droplets are sitting in there.
You can't get it out of your mind.
No, I can't.
Geoffrey is upped his hotels. Because many of his clients are very upscale properties, he can stay for less than you and I do. So his book is La Mamounia in Morocco, or Bauer Lac in Zurich, Switzerland. Great hotels of the world, and it's a delight to read about them. And of course, he notes everything about them. Not only do you note everything about them, you have, I don't know if you can remember these numbers, but I'll read them for you, because he keeps a spreadsheet. Geoffrey, 106 countries, 4.5 million air miles, 9,200 flying hours. That's 1 year and 18 days of his life. A dozen ocean-going transatlantic crossings and cruises, scores of trains, a dozen safaris, 1,200 hotels, hundreds of Michelin-starred meals. You have kept since 14 a logbook of every flight you ever took, the airline, the aircraft, the distance, and the hours. And your wife, Noah, arranged a website where these flights would all be recorded. So with a flick of a mouse, you can tell how many hundreds of thousands of miles you've flown on Air France versus Delta or British Airways. There is a bit of psychoanalysis and therapy that is suggested by your book as I read it.
A bit? It is. It's shall we say, unusual.
We have heard a couple times, yes.
And it is, but this website that Noah created for me is a joy, and only I can get into it. It's Geoffrey Weill. Well, yes, the Mossad probably can, or Edward Snowden no doubt could if he was interested. But yeah, I like to look at it and count how many times I've flown a 747 or the Concorde, and I kept a list of every single hotel that I've ever stayed in, including nowadays the room number. And there's a little grading in there for a hotel that's particularly unusual or for a grand hotel. I don't have a grading for a hotel that stinks, although I've stayed in many. But it is, as I say at the beginning, it's an obsession, but it's sort of harmless.
It is harmless. Yes.
But it is peculiar, I'm
you're not
ready to admit it.
You're not alone in the library thing. Leslie writes, I'm happy to hear that I'm not alone in finding books in the library a bit icky. So you're not alone in the library.
Excellent.
To me, and was married to and have had several girlfriends who are very germophobic, and I never heard about the library thing. I can't wait to tell you one more phobia. All right. So your first job, as a young man, you go to Thomas Cook, which was at the time, until recently, till about 2019, one of the largest travel agencies in the world, out of London, offices everywhere, including the United States. And you go to work there, and you're dealing with customers who are coming in, and apparently you're in a lineup with other agents who are waiting to grab the richest looking person walking in to hope they'll book a trip with them so they get a larger commission. And that led you into the travel agency world at Thomas Cook in London. And you eventually found your way to New York because you wanted to leave London. And so I guess in your early 20s, you started working for Thomas Cook, mid-20s in New York? I
started in 1973. I finagled my way from London to New York, even though Cook's worldwide was one family. The American arm of Cook's was actually a different company. But I was able to persuade them to send me to New York rather than my having to do it on my own. I came by ship in the January of 1973. And yes, and I became a salesman in the very grand offices that were on Fifth Avenue and 48th Street. And as you mentioned, people would just walk in off the street and book a world cruise. It doesn't happen like that anymore. Can I read a paragraph of what your sure. Description of that job? In 24 months, this is from Geoffrey Weill's book. In 24 months, I encountered every graduation of New York traveler: the highly experienced, the novice, the inquiring, the jaundiced, the bumptious, the shy, the extraordinarily knowledgeable, the paralyzingly ignorant. I met husbands who loathed their wives and were being bludgeoned into taking a trip they dreaded. I advised honeymooners expectant of romance, passion, daiquiris, and palm trees. I aided single travelers in search of company, or Mr. or Ms. Right, or on one occasion, both. They were the escapers from boredom, the yearners for discovery, the vacationers aching for excitement to wrench them out of their daily grind. That's what it was. That's a pretty, and it still is. It's just not face to face with a Thomas Cook salesman. Right. And it was, as I say in the book, appearances were deceptive. There were about 10 of us in a long counter that stretched to the back of the office. And if somebody unpromising came in, you would kind of go to your desk and start feigning enormously weighty tasks. And I was usually the one left at the counter. And there was this really unimpressive looking lady that came in, and everybody kind of turned away. And it was me that got her. And within 45 minutes, she'd booked a round the world tour and then a tour of Europe, and flew first class. And my colleagues were really pissed off that this new kid on the block had landed this. Oh, that's me in Latvia in an underground nuclear Soviet bunker.
As I recall, it's underneath an old folks' home.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
So because you were the junior guy among those 10 people standing there, you got pushed the ones who didn't look like they could afford a subway token to get out to the Bronx,
Exactly.
right?
Right.
And she walked in, and how much did she spend on the worldwide cruise? The woman who looked like the most unpromising client in the world.
Well, there was this one woman that I suppose it was about $5,000 in those days, which was a great deal of money in 1973.
Like $30,000 today.
But then there was a woman that came in off the street to book a world cruise on a ship called the Gripsholm of the Swedish America line. And the cabin she wanted was $33,000, which is in today's money about $250,000.
Oh, it was $33,000 in money then.
And then, oh yeah.
This is when annual salaries were maybe $12,000, right?
Yes. Yeah. This was a moneyed lady. She lived on Park Avenue, and just walked in, and I tell the story because it's really pertinent to my younger experience and my older experience, because she wanted to go on this ship called the Gripsholm, the Swedish American line, and I got them on the line, and they told me they had room, but they'd have to get back to me. And I said, and I didn't quite understand, so I called upstairs. There was the downstairs where we were at the counter, but upstairs there was another department where the aristocracy made their travel reservations, and the manager of it, a man called Bill Plenge, I knew would be able to tell me what the hell was going on. And I ran up to his office, and he had the Swedish America line on the phone, and he knew that I was trying to get this woman a cabin. And he said to me, "Is she Jewish?" And I said, "What?" And he said, "Is she Jewish?" Like he was talking to a half-wit. And I said, "No, I'm sure she's not." And he said into the phone, "She's okay." And he turned to me and he said, "The cabin's confirmed." And I went back downstairs and I told her she's confirmed, and I wrote out all the tickets, and she wrote a check for $33,000, and out she went to the world on a 108-day cruise. But I was outraged that this kind of thing could happen in America, in the land of the free, in the place where I thought such a thing could not happen, but it did. And the Swedish America line was noted for being what was in those days called restricted, or as restricted as it could be still in the 1970s.
That's incredible.
Yeah, really was.
That is incredible. This is you looking at, I believe it's a Jewish War Memorial in...
No, it's the Jewish Museum in a town called Essaouira in Morocco.
Morocco, right.
Which used to be called Mogador, which was where my great-grandfather grew up. And this is a photograph of part of my family from the turn of the 20th century, or earlier, 1890. Mogador was a town, a port, to which my great-grandfather moved. He was born in the desert. He moved there in the 1840s. No, in the 1860s. And it was the biggest trading port in Morocco. It was also a town that was 50% Jewish. and 50% Muslim, and everybody was friendly and everybody got on. And he moved eventually in the 1870s to London and married my great-grandmother, who came from Tangier, and became very wealthy. And it was his son that went to Australia in the early 20th century and married my grandmother, who was Christian. And my mother was born in 1909, and they had to come to England in 1912 for my mother to be converted, and my grandmother, so that they could benefit from my great-grandfather's will, which I have a copy of, which is about this thick, that laid out all sorts of bequests and had the limitation that bequests to grandchildren could only be made if they were Jewish. Thus, my mother and grandmother had to convert. And Mogador, or Essaouira as it is now, has become, I mean, Jimi Hendrix discovered in the 70s, but it's now a very chic little town in Morocco. And this museum, which incidentally has been curated by my cousin who lives in Jerusalem, but he was born in Morocco, was opened by the king in 2019. And it is actually very beautiful, quite fascinating.
Your whole family, this book, I mean, you almost need a map in the front of the book for the family relatives, because you have a fascinating family, and your descriptions of them. I mean, as I've often tell people, PR people can't write. They can write press releases. That's all they can write. And this book is beautifully written. I mean, Geoffrey Weill is a terrific writer. And the portraits you draw of... I'm sorry?
Thank you.
You're welcome. The portraits you draw of your various family members are alternately hilarious, but always fascinating. And I don't know, should I give away some of that stuff at the end of the book about your dad? And should we give that away?
Let's just say that I learned something about my father's
past
when I was 35 that was quite startling and
upended your life.
Really wonderful.
It upended your life and your brother's life.
Yes,
worth reading the book to get to that part. It is an extraordinary story. After you've become part of the family, part of the Weill family, which is all over Europe, helped along by such terrible things as World War II. Once you get to know the family, and then there's a shock at the toward the end of the story that is made me cry. Frankly, I mean, I was happy, but it's really, really interesting. Okay, so what I wanted to find was, I know. You said that one thing you learned before, this is before, of course, you started your public relations agency, when you were working at Cook. One thing you learned that it struck you that at least half of your clients, and I quote you here, yearned less actually to see the sights than to have seen them. That the 20 minutes of Notre Dame could never hope to compare either with the thrill of expectation prior to a trip, and we do know there's studies saying that prior to the trip is the most exciting part of someone's trip, or with the sense of accomplishment that accompanied the satisfaction that Notre Dame was not merely seen and photographed, but out of the way, finished, cross off the list, and on to the next.
Yeah, I mean, nowadays it's called the bucket list, and everybody knows it, but it wasn't called it then. And I don't want to say I invented it, but I certainly felt it and I saw it, that people did have a list. It was either printed or it was up here in the brain of the places they wanted to have been. And because Thomas Cook was so grand and so cosseting, we made it easy for people to do it. But they really didn't want to. I just always felt that the photograph taken outside Notre Dame was more important than the 20 minutes or half an hour or hour inside looking at the buttresses and looking at the stained glass windows. It was all about having done it, having been,
yeah.
And it was fascinating. And you see it today in cruises, that people pick a cruise that will take them to 8 ports, and they can say that they've been to these 8 places, and they're 3 hours ashore, which becomes a bit of a chore because it's much more fun on the ship than going around in a bus, seeing 3 sites and then being taken to the inevitable shop to buy whatever the guide will get commission on. But it gets those 8 places off the list. Whoosh, done. And as you say, on to the next.
And today, I think it's Instagram. I've got to get the picture for Instagram. Almost more than I'm enjoying hanging off this cliff or whatever, or under this waterfall.
Absolutely.
How do I look?
Absolutely.
How do I look?
Absolutely. Well,
we have Ms. Pierce asks what your favorite luxury hotel is. Go ahead. Stick your foot in your mouth on this one, Geoffrey.
I will, because it isn't a client. It is La Mamounia in Marrakesh.
In Marrakesh.
I think, and second is the King David in Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. They are my personal favorite hotels. Are they the 2 of the world's best hotels? They're up there. There are others, like the Adlon in Berlin. There's Claridge's in London. But my absolute total favorite is, La Mamounia. There is something about it, despite its 38 different renovations over the years, that you can still feel that Churchill was once there. And it has a grandeur and a gorgeousness that is truly unique. And in fact, I'm going there next month.
I have to add a footnote here because my daughter, who is now in her 40s and lives in Europe, in England and France, I took her there. We did a dad-daughter trip to Morocco, including Marrakesh, and stayed at La Mamounia when she was, maybe 13 or 14. And we had a restaurant recommendation from the hotel and had a great dinner of pigeon and pine nuts. And at 3 a.m, she sat straight up in bed and retched for about 15 minutes in the bed. So I know she's watching this because she knows you from her days working as a PR person in New York. And so I have to tell the story because I know right now she's going, I like La Mamounia too, except that one night. It happens. But you've been ill in a hotel room, I know. We all have, I think, at times.
Yes.
Yeah.
We all have. And I've had hotel doctors who appear within 20 minutes of a phone call to the concierge, and $200 later, and
it happened.
You're full of antibiotics. And
Zoe wants to know what authors influenced your writing? Do the name Paul Theroux mean anything to you?
Does the name Paul Theroux mean anything to me? Yes, it does. I don't know who influenced my writing. I think Paul Theroux, certainly. I love his writing, particularly his travel writing. But I don't know that I've modeled mine after his. Interestingly, I've just read a book by a woman called Barbara Amiel, who is a Canadian American English Jewish writer for Canadian newspapers and for various Rupert Murdoch papers, who has written an autobiography which is very dense and one of the most beautifully written books I have ever read. And I gave a copy of it to my cousin and my first wife, because in my family, marrying cousins is quite a normal thing to do.
That does come out in your book.
And I gave her this book, and I told her it is exquisitely written. And she read, I suppose, the first 2 chapters, and she called me up and she said, "You know why you like her writing so much?" And I said, "No." She said, "It's because she writes like you do."
What's the book?
It is called, what is it called? Friends and Enemies
Okay.
by
All right.
Barbara Amiel, and I recommend it from the bottom of my heart. It is exquisite. Some of the most, you know, as you say, there are books that you skim through, or there are books that you just go through. But this one, every third paragraph, I had to read again because its writing was so exquisitely constructed. So that's a book I would recommend.
I want to flatter you just one more time, I promise. But your description for your eye and your talent at communicating through writing details is exquisite. Your description of people, even from your childhood, their faces, their everything, how their styles, what sort of personality emanates from the whole person, was breathtaking. This is a book to read. This is a book to read, not just to see how weird Geoffrey Weill is, although that's very amusing, but also to read a writer which leads to my question. Mark asks, he says, Marcy says, thank you, and look forward to my stay. We must have somebody about to go to Mamunia. We love Mamunia. I love it too. My daughter would still say she loved it. Just one bad night. And that wasn't the hotel's fault. Mark asks, do you enjoy the writing process?
Yes, I do. I enjoy it very much. Particularly, it's interesting. I've started to try and write not fiction, and I'm not very good at it. I'm having a problem with it. But writing about what I know and what I've done and what I've seen and what I've noted, I enjoy very much. I'm a little worried about some of the descriptions of my family and friends that are in the book, those that are still alive. A lot of the people that I write about died 50 years ago, but a lot of the people I write about are still alive. And in some cases, I've changed their names because I have been very open and maybe a little too open about their lives and their foibles and their accents. But yeah, I do enjoy writing. And I had just in the last 3 months, because until December 31st, I had the European passport. It's now just a British passport. I was able to go to Europe in September and again in October, and went all over the place. And I wrote a daily diary that went on a couple of websites and it was wonderful to come back to my hotel room every evening and write. I think quite trenchantly, but wittily and curiously about my day.
I always say people who enjoy writing don't have to do it for a living. Having written 2
Right.
books and with no desire to write a third, and having written thousands of magazine pieces. As I said at the start of this, I wish I'd gone into public relations. The press releases are only a page long at best. And I love you guys, but but most people say they love writing, never do it, never certainly finish it, whatever they're writing. And if they do finish it, they don't write like you do. That's why I recommend this book to our audience. It's called Welcome Abroad.
Abroad.
I'm sorry?
Abroad.
Oh, excuse me, All Abroad. I'm sorry. All as opposed to All Aboard. It's All Abroad. Yes, there it is, right there. And now, how could one get it today if we've whetted the appetite of and our YouTube viewers for when this is posted in a day or so?
It's on Amazon. It's on barnesandnoble.com. It's at independent bookstores. In Britain, it's at Waterstones. What I'm really happy about is that it's being published simultaneously in England and in America and in England. Sure. Because the University of Wisconsin Press, who were fabulous to work with, have a branch in Britain, so that it is a book that I hope will also speak to an English audience, because it's written by somebody who sounds like I do, but who feels himself nowadays to be fully an American. And And I've no objection to people knowing where I stand politically. After yesterday, which was January the 20th, for those of you who watch it on YouTube,
Good
I
point.
feel like a reborn American. I'm proud to be an American again.
I should point out, as you mentioned, we are doing this live on January 21st, 2021. But of course, it's going to go on YouTube, where it'll outlive Geoffrey, me, and our children. But the book does go on sale in hardback on Amazon, etc., Barnes and Noble. February 22nd, is it?
Yes, it is.
So
yeah.
1 month.
And also on Kindle and Nook, and for those people like me who never read a physical book anymore, I only read books on my iPad. Exactly. And how many books can you have? I mean, this is.
I know. I have, I lived in Washington for about 40 years, and all my friends are, including me, writing books. And you go to their book parties, and you have to buy their book. I mean, it's a polite thing to do.
Right.
And I have for my friends, and now, as I get older, I go, who needs all these books? And I can't throw hers away. I can't throw his away. It's a problem. Yeah. But yours is a keeper, and I have it electronically, so I can keep it on my laptop for posterity. It's a heck of a book. Read it for the writing, for the descriptions, for his joy of travel, and his eye for detail of both people and the stories of the people in Geoffrey's life. And as I say, there is a surprise ending. Don't skip to the back to read it. Get there in a leisurely way. Geoffrey Weill, I can't thank you enough for joining us today.
Well, thank you.
Just delighted you wrote this book. I was so thrilled to read it, and I don't say that all the time, believe me. So.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Geoffrey, you have your own website, don't you?
Yes, geoffreyweill.com.
And Geoffrey is the, I guess, English spelling, Geoffrey. Geoffrey Weill, Weill. You can see his name you saw the cover, and you can see it in the upper right-hand corner here. Geoffrey, thank you so much for taking the time out of your afternoon to talk to us, and good luck with sales of the book.
Thank you so much, Rudy.
And we'll be back in 2 weeks. We're doing this every other Thursday. And if you don't get my newsletter, it's free. Just go to maxatours.com, go down to the end, and you can put in your name and your email, and you'll get it. And that's sort of my personal writing about travel and travel tips and new things happening in the travel industry and so on. And I'll be mentioning Geoffrey's book in there. I can't wait to write next week's newsletter. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you again in 2 weeks. Take care.